Hey guys, Justin here, bringing you another slightly nerdy video in order to help you be more comfortable in the backcountry. If you are into backpacking and camping, you've probably come across what could be considered a newfangled sleep system, and that's the backpacking quilt. I personally think that backpacking quilts are the best way for most people to have a really good, comfortable sleep in the backcountry, but I see a lot of misinformation out there about quilts. And today I'm gonna bust 5 myths that could be leading to mistrust and holding you back from having the best sleep in the backcountry when you're on your backpacking and camping trips. I'm also going to post links to 2 different videos in the video description. One explaining what a backpacking quilt actually is, and the second one talking about why I think quilts are better than sleeping bags. So if you're new to backpacking quilts, definitely go check those out because this isn't your grandma's quilt. And the first myth is that a quilt is just a sleeping bag that's unzipped and opened up and draped over you. And on first look, if you lay a quilt next to a sleeping bag, they do look very similar. But there's some key differences between a quilt and sleeping bag that could be the difference between having a really good night's sleep and a miserable sleep. So what is the difference between a quilt and a sleeping bag? First up, a quilt won't have a hood at the head end. A sleeping bag usually will have a hood here. The second difference is that a quilt doesn't have a zipper. So there's no zipper on here in order to connect the quilt all the way up, where a sleeping bag has that. And because of that, there's a lot less material used in order to make a quilt versus a sleeping bag. No hood, no bottom to the quilt, and no zipper. And you may think that those are negatives, but they actually make the quilt a lot lighter than an equivalently warm sleeping bag. As well, those features allow you to toss and turn inside the quilt without getting tangled up like you might with a sleeping bag. Some features that a quilt has that a sleeping bag doesn't have. First up, usually has a snap at the neck here in order to close up the hole at the top, and then a cinch at the top that you can cinch down around your neck in order to eliminate drafts around your shoulders. As well, a quilt will usually have pad straps. So that's little clips and straps that are attached to the sleeping pad that keep the quilt in place on the sleeping pad. And all these features are critical in order to help you have a good night's sleep by eliminating drafts and keeping you warm inside of your quilt. The next myth that I see talked about all the time is that quilts are drafty. People think that if you're sleeping under a quilt, you're always going to be having air rushing in, wind's going to be getting at you underneath the quilt, and that's just not the case. A quilt isn't like a blanket. If you use the features that we just talked about correctly, then you won't have any drafts coming in underneath your quilt. Like I mentioned, using the pad straps that a quilt has, as well as the neck snap and cinch, are ways in order to eliminate drafts when you're using the quilt. But what I see all the time is that people using these features incorrectly, especially with the pad straps. What I see all the time, and this isn't the correct way to use pad straps, is that people have the connection point for the pad strap right up on top of the sleeping pad, almost underneath you, so that the quilt wraps around you. And I see this recommended quite a bit as well, and that's not the correct way to use pad straps in order to eliminate drafts. As you can see, if I'm tossing and turning on top of the sleeping pad, I'm lifting up the pad strap in this position and creating an air gap between the quilt and the sleeping pad. Contrast that with having the connection point for the pad strap a little bit more wrapped around the sleeping pad, not underneath the sleeping pad, but right up on the side where it hits the ground. And then when I'm tossing and turning like that, you can see the quilt lifts the pad straps up a little bit, but I'm not creating any drafts between the sleeping pad and the quilt. Also, make sure that you're using 2 pad straps or more with your quilt. You can see I have an Enlightened Equipment quilt here, and it came with 2 pad straps, and that way you get really good seal on the back and the front of the quilt. Some quilts out there only come with 1 pad strap, and I've been told this is due to a patent on using 2 pad straps on a quilt, but if you can, get 2 pad straps and make sure that you're locking them both down onto the sleeping pad. And then for your head around your shoulders, that's another place where you can get a lot of drafts in if you're not using the features correctly. If you do have the snap underneath you here and then cinch up this cord here, then you get a really good seal around your neck and shoulders and eliminate drafts anywhere in that area. Another myth that I hear about is that because a quilt doesn't wrap all the way around you like a sleeping bag does and is open on the bottom, that you need a warmer sleeping pad in order to stay warm. But regardless of whether you're using a quilt or a sleeping bag, most of that bottom insulation comes from the sleeping pad itself and not from whatever material is underneath you. If you're using a sleeping bag, then you're actually compressing all of that insulation that you're sleeping on to such a degree that you're essentially rendering it useless. And I actually think it's unsafe to rely on that extra little bit of insulation that you get from that compressed sleeping bag in order to not freeze while you're out on a backcountry trip. As a result, an adequately warm sleeping pad for a sleeping bag will also be adequately warm for a quilt. And I have here the Thermarest X-Therm sleeping pad, and I've used this pad with a quilt and a sleeping bag down to -20, no problem. If you're interested in any of the gear that I'm talking about today, whether that's my sleeping pad or my quilt, I'll post links in the video description where you can go check that gear out. The fourth myth that I hear all the time is that quilts just aren't as warm as sleeping bags, and kind of related to that you can't use quilts in the wintertime. And while I think some of this has to do with the myths that we previously talked about with regards to drafts and sleeping pad warmth, I also think that there's a general misunderstanding about how insulation keeps you warm. Regardless of whether you're talking about quilts or sleeping bags, the warmth that you get has to do with the loft or the thickness of that insulation. For example, if we're talking about synthetic insulation, the thicker that synthetic insulation is, the warmer it's going to be, and that holds true with down as well. The taller the baffles are that are filled with down, the warmer that quilt or sleeping bag is going to be. Also keep in mind that we need to be comparing apples to apples. Sleeping bag manufacturers usually advertise the limit rating of their products, whereas quilt manufacturers are usually advertising the comfort rating of their products. So for that reason, a quilt that's rated 20 degrees Fahrenheit for comfort will be just as warm as a sleeping bag that's also rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit for comfort. And that's because both products will have the same loft or thickness of insulation. So for these reasons, quilts are just as warm as sleeping bags and can be used in the wintertime. Like I said, I've used quilts down to -20 degrees Celsius or -4 degrees Fahrenheit with no problems. If you're worried about your head getting cold, then just wear a toque like I am now, or you can also get hoods. This is a down hood, and you can wear these as well. If you are interested in picking up a hood, I wouldn't get a down one like I have here. I'd actually pick up a synthetic one because they'll manage moisture from your breath quite a bit better. Enlightened Equipment makes a great synthetic hood. If you're interested in that, I'll post a link in the video description. And the fifth myth that I hear all the time is that quilts are only for hardcore backpackers or thru hikers. And I completely disagree with that. I think the #1 benefit for quilts is their comfort, and I think everyone should be comfortable in the backcountry. I do a lot of research and testing in order to find what will make me the most comfortable in the backcountry, and through decades of experience, I've landed on quilts as being the best option for me in order to sleep comfortably in the backcountry. But that's not to say that they're for everyone. I definitely understand that there are some people out there who just want to be cocooned in a sleeping bag, and that's the most comfortable option for them. Quilts will continue to be part of my sleep system when heading out into the backcountry. If you're interested in my comfort gear list, I'll post a link to that video right up there. As you'll see, there's a lot of gear on this list that is lightweight and can really help you be more comfortable when you're in the backcountry, whether that's through sleeping or just hanging around camp or when hiking on the trail. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.